In September 2013, new Chinese President Xi Jinping made arguably one of the most important speeches of the 21st century. And I don't mean the most important so far, I mean across the whole century, this will go down as one of the most significant speeches. Funnily enough, it wasn't made to the Chinese Congress or during a state visit to the United States. It was made in a Kazakhstani university whose name I actually can't pronounce. Basically, Xi announced that a new economic belt between China and Central Asia was in the works, famously labelling it the Silk Road economic belt, after the ancient Silk Road which had created a trade network from China to Europe. Next up in October, Xi flew down to Indonesia and announced that a Maritime Silk Road was also in the works for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And as most would know, this whole initiative became known as the Belt and Road Initiative, otherwise known as the New Silk Road. Its completion date? 2049, exactly 1 century on from when the Communist Party of China rose to power.
Hello there.
Okay, so today we're going to cover the second of President Xi's initiatives. Last week we covered the anti-corruption campaign, and while I am doing the housekeeping, do make sure to subscribe so that you become an expert in understanding the world around us. And so Xi's New Silk Road involves two components. The belt, which is land-based connecting infrastructure such as railways, roads and bridges, and the road, which is sea-based connecting infrastructure such as shipping ports and industrial parks. Essentially, with these projects, China's aim is to connect almost the whole world together and create a global trade network. And so straight away, the red flags are going up, and I'm guessing most here are thinking, well, obviously this is part of their plan to become the dominant influence in the world. And that's not an entirely false conclusion, but I do think it's a little more complex. China is the world's largest exporter and second largest importer, meaning that the sea lanes are vital for the Chinese economy. In 2013, the existing sea lanes, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, had a very strong US presence, and so China was dependent upon the protection of the US Navy for safe passage of Chinese goods. And given that China had risen to being a direct trading competitor of the US, it was far from an ideal situation to have them as the watchdogs of their goods. Imagine if in the 1960s the Soviets were responsible for the safety of America's imports and exports. Secondly, the belt is a vital part of China's strategy to maintain domestic stability. Deng Xiaoping did say, after all, that some needed to get rich first, and by 2013 there was a great imbalance between the eastern urban wealth and the rural western wealth. Hu Jintao did attempt to address this with some reforms which you can see in this episode here, and they were helpful, but they didn't completely close the chasm. And for Xi, the situation became increasingly difficult to manage because the West wasn't just less wealthy, but it was where much of the separatist sentiment was. The conversation around Tibetan independence has been pretty much around since its annexation into the PRC, but the 21st century saw a string of protests, uprisings and immolations. For Xinjiang, the uprisings got extremely violent, and China saw what would mean any Western definition of terrorist attacks between the end of the noughties and the start of the tens. Now, of course, economic liberty is not the driving factor behind why these Western provinces want independence, but as a general rule of thumb of history, increased wealth does seem to correlate with increased stability. And so for Xi, if these Western provinces could be linked with Central Asia, it would greatly increase the supply lanes for the Western provinces. And so since 2013, the Belt and Road has incorporated all of these countries here, and importantly used Chinese construction companies and labour forces to carry out the projects so that the risk of foreign governments embezzling the contracts will be minimised. Now, obviously I'm not going to go through each project, but we will look at a few examples to understand the network that China is creating. So in Central Asia, China have worked on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where China's funded $62 billion worth of infrastructure. Now, some of this infrastructure is to do with transport networks, but some of it is to do with things like energy plants. Pakistan's really important because it provides an exit route to the Arabian Sea to then ship to Africa. To put it in layman's terms, in order for that to be a viable network, the infrastructure had to look a little bit better than that Modern Warfare 2 map that I got my first tactical nuke on. In Europe, there's the Eurasian land bridges, which connect railways and roads from Western China to Western Russia, then out to even Poland and Germany. There have also been smaller scale intra-Europe projects such as the Budapest-Belgrade Railway, in which China financed 85% of the projects and cut the travel time from 8 hours to 3.5 hours. And if Austro-Hungarians could flee Serbia that quickly 100 years ago, who knows how different the world would be today. Now, the obvious subtext for this is that it's a loan and not a gift, and also that it creates easier trade networks for China to benefit from as well. And so with the Maritime Road, it extends down to Southeast Asia with ports in Jakarta, then northwest to Colombo in Sri Lanka, then as far west as Nairobi in Kenya, and then north through the Suez Canal to Europe. In fact, the road nearly reached as far down under as Australia. The Premier of the state Victoria, basically the governor of our second most populated state, signed something of an expression of interest in bringing Victoria into the Belt and Road. Now, importantly, Daniel Andrews belongs to the Labour Party. At the federal level, the Liberal Party are the guys in power, and this went against their much more hardline anti-China stance. And after 3 years of fighting, just a couple of months ago, Australia's Foreign Minister basically said, it's not happening. But returning to the road obviously reaches Africa, where China is targeting much of its attention. I've addressed this in an earlier video, but there's two main schools of thought here. Number one, China's a benevolent power to the Africans and helping them build needed infrastructure. But then there's thought process number two, where it says that China's trying to debt trap them. A technique where China intentionally gives them loans that they cannot repay to leverage in return for strategic assets such as possession of a port. Most people who argue for this school of thought appeal to the Hambantota port, which was acquired by the Chinese on a 99-year lease after Sri Lanka was unable to repay their debt. And I'm hesitant to commit to either. Firstly, I do think it's a little naive to think any country does anything out of benevolence, but also we actually don't have access to the terms of these Chinese loans, and it does take something of a cynical leap of faith to assume that it's intentional debt trapping. In my personal view, Africa's just the fastest growing continent in terms of population, and China wants to get in now and gain the allegiance of countries who will be much more powerful in half a century's time. Whether they're on their knees or not, China just wants them on slack. And this brings me on to my final point. In the West, we're pretty prone to a condescending view of the Chinese government, mainly that there's much less democratic freedom than we have in the West. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad that I have that freedom and I'm not desperate to go live in China. But here is the shortcoming. The Chinese government can be incredibly competent at what they do because their system allows them to be. Do you think any of the G7 leaders are making a plan for how their country is going to move from here to 2050? No, and not through any fault of their own. If Trump or Biden announced that their budget was going to take a hit in the hundreds of billions to make loans to foreign countries for a payoff that would come good in 2049, they'd get themselves voted out in a term. I could be wrong here, and maybe I have just exploded the comment section, but maybe the people's right to choose their government comes at the cost of that government having a long-term vision. Thanks for watching. I didn't mean to get political there. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. It's free to do, and it might just help you hold your own at the water cooler. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.